Hi, Anna. So nice to
Good morning.
have the opportunity to have this chat with you, and thank you so much for making time.
My
We've
pleasure. It's been a while, hasn't it?
yeah, how long we've been in touch since 2015, no, 16, 16 or
Something
17.
around there,
Yeah,
yeah.
it
And the
was
last
when
time I saw you was in Bruges when you came and joined our Travel to Tomorrow exploration.
thank you so much for that invitation. I
It
learned
started,
it.
it was great.
Yeah. So yeah, the topic, of course, for our conversation would be this exploration that is rising all around the world, but that I feel whether you use the word regenerative or you didn't use the word regenerative, it doesn't really matter. You have been in this inquiry for, from what my research gives me, at least 25 years. I mean, I just want to read this one sentence here. What is needed is a small circle, a small critical mass of conspirators, both visionaries and practitioners, who are willing and committed to translate the vision into practical action so that all participants in the community can identify with it and adopt as appropriate in their involvement, interests, and roles. What is needed are some courageous leaders standing at point A of the old tourism curve with the vision to see how to initiate a new tourism curve. And in that paper from 1995, you were speaking to really both the power of what tourism can do to connect us as humanity together
Mm.
and the deep thus functionalities of where tourism was heading then. And since then, tourism has exploded and has become such a big industry that now in a pandemic world, we're realizing how even wealthy, not just some beautiful paradisical island state somewhere in the global south that only had tourism as an income, but even really wealthy economies with big other legs to stand on are shaken by the fact that their tourism industry is in danger. And I mean, I live on the island of Mallorca. We basically had the economy collapse here in the last 2 months, and the whole of Spain, Portugal, so many of the southern European nations have tourism so central to their economy and therefore also to some extent the well-being of a lot of people. And what's your reading? Like I sense we wanted a sea change, like when we talked in Bruges in September last year. We were talking about how tourism can be the motor of the transformation towards a different type of regionalization and actually helping local businesses thrive and local regenerative economies thrive. But now this motor seems to have serious problems.
Yeah, it's certainly not it's not starting the way we'd like, but and it's not a motor, is it? It's made up of a lot of flawed living systems called human beings. Yeah, I just in conversation with you earlier, I just realized the sort of nature of the journey. In the 1990s, I was about to leave Canada, but in the literally the last year before I left, I was able to spend a lot more time with First Nations people. And I began to get really interested in their worldview and the whole systems approach. And that's when I wrote that paper in '95 and talked about the medicine wheel. And if it's relevant today, it's because the Indigenous people have such a grounded, holistic view of the world, and that's what we desperately need at the moment. But what was interesting is I came to Europe, and I'd also got involved at that time with technology, IT. It was the birth of the commercial internet in 1993, 94, same year. And I did a conference then with a wonderful man called Don Tapscott, who's a leader in the IT movement, a very wise man, as it turns out to be. And what that introduced me to for the next few years, which is why, in a sense, I pulled back a little bit on the surface. I appeared to pull back from this this line of inquiry, because I got fascinated with the notion that tourism is a network. It's not an industry, and the reason we're in such trouble is that we're imposing a hierarchical system of silos and boxes and linear connections on what is a living dynamic network. And one of the things that COVID has shown, more than anything else, is just how pervasive that network had become, how it had spread almost like a meme or an infection, actually, everywhere. It was connected now with everything. But it was still being governed and structured in people's minds and operated as if it were some kind of a vertically integrated industry. And I think that's one of the reasons why it collapsed so quickly. If it was living according to the natural principles of a network, a living network, and living according to and all life is a network, isn't it? If it was really living according to how that works in nature, it wouldn't have collapsed the way it's done. It had no resilience. It was brittle. It's fragile. So you have, on the one hand, a whole economic sector that has become so embedded in society, and yet at the same time has become so incredibly fragile. It's an interesting story. So the time I spent in technology really was helpful. It led me into complexity science and trying to understand. To be honest with you, I found that almost too much for my brain. But you don't have to get into the nitty-gritty of all of that to understand that these principles, these dynamics, are what we need to be consciously applying now.
What's
have I answered your question, or have I gone off on a reverie?
No. I mean, it would be. No, let's stay there. Like where do you, in your conversations with people in the tourism sector in the last few months, do you sense that people are actually aware how fundamental the change is that has now been triggered? Like what I notice here on Mallorca is that everybody is responding to the pandemic situation and trying to come up with ways that people can still go to restaurants or sit at the pool but maintain social distancing. And there's new protocols being written by the government that are pages long, that now small tourism businesses that are basically dying and struggling to keep their head above water are now laden with new directives on how, if you want to open, you have to do it this way. And for me, it seems almost like yesterday finally we were allowed out here again. I went for a walk and I saw the first couple of restaurants that had opened and had "We are open, come in," and I could see the staff standing there kind of twiddling their thumbs and the owner looking slightly shell-shocked. And I just really felt for these people, because I feel like this is going to happen all over Mallorca. They're going to open their hotels and people aren't going to come.
No, I think, well, yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I don't think there is any real understanding, even at the leadership level in tourism, just how fundamentally, how deeply affected and how fundamental this shift is. They keep talking about the pandemic and saying it's an unprecedented event, and that's used usually to excuse the fact that we weren't prepared for it, or we don't know how to handle it. You know, it's huge and it's unprecedented, but ultimately they're all saying it will go away. And in the meantime, we're going to use all of these crazy measures that undermine the very essence of hospitality in the first place. I mean, who wants to go out? It means it's a wonderful opportunity for the whole, those technocrats that want everything to be done by robots to sell their wares. It's proving to be a wonderful opportunity for the IT community that want to invade our privacy and have us working on apps and go outside and check your app. Oops, there's someone over there that's got COVID, or blah, 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 better run for cover, sort of thing. I mean, it's all of this stuff is separating us. So it's that separation model that is working. And at the same time, with this focus right now on the pandemic, it's as if climate change has gone away. No one's remembering the fires in Australia that was only 6 months ago. So the notion that we're in that vortex right now of a converging of these issues, whether they're climate change or biodiversity loss or wealth disparity or runaway technology, they're all still there. And what the pandemic is doing is revealing our fragility, revealing that a fundamental way of looking at the world is not serving us now. It did serve us, let's face it. It served us post-war to build the kind of lifestyle that many of us have been, not all of us, of course, the top 10% or 5% have been enjoying. But unfortunately, the decisions are being made by that top 10% of the global population. And we're living in our own bubble. We're completely unaware of just how much suffering is going on around the world.
This is what happened to me with this crisis, that I had a really strong moment of noticing how deeply touched emotionally I was by the nurses and doctors reporting from the frontline hospitals in Italy and Madrid, and getting really like deeply emotional over it, and then realizing, wait a minute, this has been going on almost through my entire life in hospitals all around the global south, where people had to make these triage decisions of saying, there's too many people starving here, these two won't make it anyway, I'm going to go to this bed now.
Yep.
And the horror of that decision being put in front of any human being, and somehow we've been complicit in listening to statistics like that of how many hundreds of thousands of people die of air pollution, millions of people die, 42 million people a year die of the effects of urban particle air pollution.
Yeah, but that's fascinating because, well, I agree with you 100% that we think of the people that have been dying from road accidents exceeds the number of people that in the UK, I think, that died from COVID. I'm not sure. But I mean, it's all of a sudden we have just focused on this and done Herculean responses. Mm-hmm. And you have to ask, why this? Is it because it got touched? It got pretty close to the decision makers. I mean, even our prime minister got it. Mm-hmm. And I think it shook him up because he was, prior to getting ill, he was acting with great sort of dismissive bravado because it wasn't real to him. And even now, I'm not sure how deep that experience that he had has affected him. But yeah, it's I just think, in answer to your earlier question, I don't think the tourism industry has woken up to the fact that this is deep change. Nothing's going to be the same.
But if we
unaffected recession economically is going to be far, far deeper than they are prepared for.
I mean, my sense is that there will be at least 60% less tourism for the next 2 or 3 years, and what I think most people, and including me, can't make a statement about right now is that all we've seen at this point is the effects to now of the direct impact of the closures and the virus and on the economy, and what we're not paying attention to is the dominoes that are still falling in every direction and crisscrossing and causing other dominoes. Or you was mentioning complexity theory and earlier, like once you have the training to think in these systemic networked ways, mm-hmm. and to be able to not predict and control, but get a sense of the dynamics of this larger global system, then we're not paying attention to the warnings that the World Health Organization also, or I think it was the Agricultural Organization, saying that we're running towards a world where maybe 240 million people could be starving because of not like the locust plagues and all the other things that are going on in the globe, including the effects of COVID.
Yeah, that's my point, really. It's the inability to see the interconnections and interdependencies. I mean, right now, the next thing I would imagine is this whole issue around food security for many places. You know, the whole Pacific Islands, for example, have become so dependent on this importation of the very food that's unfortunately killing them and causing diabetes and you know, heart disease and so on. They've got about 2 days of food security. So we're going to see that start to happen in our own communities, I think, far more. So one thing right now that tourism can do, I think, is that it can pivot. It's got to pivot its entire focus away from the overseas markets and focusing on the customer and spending millions of dollars in bringing people into a place, and now becoming back part of the community and focusing on how do we make tourism, how can tourism contribute to this community becoming really healthy? What we've been suggesting with some success, limited success, but in Flanders, for example, is again, you were obsessed with growth and GDP, but that produced over-tourism because you had to keep growing in order to make up for the fact that the model was producing diminishing returns every year. So you had to get bigger and bigger and bigger. But then, of course, eventually the negative impact of that in terms of the costs of congestion and resource use and so on start to bite you in the tail. So, yeah. So model is not working. And now the COVID has shown us, okay, we're now going to show you what it's like when that comes to, you know, to stop. I've got a graph of the drop of arrivals, the arrivals pattern into New Zealand, for example, of people with non-New Zealand passports. And I suddenly looked at it last night, and it's almost identical to a graph that was produced in 1997 of the collapse of the cod fishery. You know, it's that classic, you know, exponential upwards, but huge oscillations increasing, and then boom.
Yeah.
And we talked about that, but nobody was listening. Now they can see it. It's on everybody's, you know, charts. So in fact, it's back now into going inward, into land-based, community-based resilience building, and that's building community and getting people to be thinking as a network, but working, contributing to the network, not just extracting from it.
I mean, that's exactly the shift away from, okay, we have a massive problem here, but what is the potential for whatever the tourism will turn into to actually serve the communities and the regions where the tourism is active in. And that we started this conversation, or you started this conversation a long time ago, but last year when we met in Bruges, there was a real sense that more and more people around the world were having a conversation about what would a regenerative tourism really look like? How could tourism industry invest in local food, water, energy sovereignty, build resilience infrastructures that on the one hand would give the visitors the sense that the money we're spending is also serving the local community, and more visitors were starting to demand that kind of green tourism or socially engaged tourism. But now I see that for, like, if I think about just the Mallorcan case, how can I invite the key players in the large Mallorcan tourism companies into a conversation that says there are going to be a lot less people coming, and they're going to be coming in different patterns, and the whole offer has to transform. Like I'm kind of questioning whether people will just jump on a plane to have a little bit of holiday if they know that the virus is still out there and they're risking their families' well-being if they just go on a short trip. Like the whole kind of city breaks, short trip break patterns. I think people won't take the risk. B, most people won't have the money because they're struggling in their own employment situation or company situation. It's like here on Mallorca, a lot of people that had second homes on Mallorca who live in Northern Europe and have companies in Northern Europe will probably end up having to sell their holiday homes in order to save their companies back home. And so what's your vision in terms of the actual pattern change? Like I can see using the infrastructure for longer stay offers where people, like for example, retired people can come for 3 months, but they have to go through a certain quarantine phase, and then they're sort of on the island and they can use the infrastructure. Or educational aspect of working, like engaging with the local community, where it becomes a serving of the community and an experience in the community. Because in the past, travel was all about seeing with new eyes and learning, and people would ask the question for most of our history: is it worth me taking the risk of this journey? And that for a while wasn't a question that anybody asks. And it got cheaper and cheaper to fly, and so people just did it. But I think that question will be at the center again, and so we need to have offers that make it worth it to travel again in a different way. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. Well, I think the reality is that the whether it's 6 months or 2 years, whatever, but the international market is going to be very slow to pick up. So a destination now has to say, well, how can people travel to us, and who will they be? So get used to the fact that the sheer volume of numbers isn't going to be there. So you're dealing with a very different set of demand. But really, the best thing that destinations can do, when I say the word destination, a destination is simply a place that people come to, right? It's a way, it's focusing our attention on this place as a recipient or a receiver of other people. But so let's maybe not use the word destination, let's use the word community. What does a community need to do right now to build back its health and resilience? And if it focuses on the tourism sector, the visitor economy part can play a very important role in that, in my opinion. But we have to say, how can we, as let's say the island of Mallorca, what are the various ways that we can try and keep some of the businesses in the visitor economy moving with cash flow, and starting to explore healthier ways of being. So reducing their costs, growing their own food, reducing their energy requirements, reducing all of those things, becoming more efficient, effective as local producers. So really almost look inward the island more. Who are we? How are we as an island going to be able to go forward? The role of the host economy, which is another way of describing it, is in fact to start pulling people together and convening them in conversations. That's really why I felt tourism had such a role to play. It is the connector, you know. It's become just a transactions. It's in the transactions business. It's in the numbers business. It's all on spreadsheets. But in actual fact, the reality was that it connected people. How can we perhaps get, and this may not be practical, but in your island, but how can we get people in the one part of the island coming and spending time in another part of the island and really enjoying their time there, having an exchange of whatever money is floating around on the island, keeping businesses afloat? How can we start to get a greater integration between the hotels and the restaurants and the agricultural business? How can we become much more self-sufficient? How can we address our food security issues? That's before we even think of just classic tourism. Because if we can build a degree of resilience, and if we can show as a place that we care about this place and we're doing everything we can to bring it back to health, we will be in a very good position to attract the kind of visitor that is looking for that. I mean, I was very surprised. I'm going to read you a quote. It was in a magazine, a business magazine in New Zealand. It was from the head of the New Zealand Trade and Export Council, and he was saying that talking about, they've got a halo effect from the reputation for having with the pandemic. But he's saying the food and beverage opportunity is at the sharp end of that. The world is hunting for health, hunting for countries that care for their people and care for their environment. So if a place is going to come out of this, it has to start caring. For example, we've got a major problem of the COVID attacking people in homes, care homes, right? Because we've parked our elderly in places where they actually are now incredibly vulnerable. We put them all together in a hermetically sealed box, and then once that virus gets in, why aren't we finding ways of getting people in that community, the elderly community, more engaged outdoors, being able to participate, not just parking them? How could we find different ways of utilizing that knowledge base, that talent base, that wisdom base? That's just one silly idea. Another is that, and again, it was a wonderful example in Flanders. They have an incredibly strong social tourism community. They have a network of 2,000 players. That's entrepreneurs, that's people in the care business, in every kind of help, social endeavor, and the municipalities that deliver social services. And they've created a network of 2,000 players such that if somebody is seen or identifies themselves as desperately needing a break, they've been a carer for a sick person in their family and haven't had a break for weeks, or if they're financially challenged, or if they have a disability, they have a network whereby they can be, a holiday can be tailor-made for them. Mm. Now, what that's doing for the commercial sector is they have a lot of spare capacity in their seasonal business. So they're often able to offer a holiday to someone at a very, very, very low price, but it keeps the lights on, it keeps the business going. But it was, to me, that was saying, we are not just here to attract the wealthy that can afford to flip on a plane. We're here to be part of the network, part of what makes our society worth having. Am I making any sense? I don't know. My examples aren't as good as they could be. But.
No, it's all wonderful. Tell me a little bit more about the, I saw, to some extent, I saw the first crescendo of the Travel to Tomorrow program that you helped to curate. But it's been a 2-year journey up to that wonderful summit in that church in Bruges where Michelle Holiday and Rob Hopkins and Andrew Sims were among the speakers, and me, which I thought it was wonderful that you brought 4 people who aren't in their primary kind of activity space daily focused on tourism to address, how many were we? 200 and some tourism professionals.
100 odd people there, yeah.
But I would love you to tell the story of that whole, like, how did you engage with Flanders, and how do you see, what did the program change so far, and how has it changed now that the pandemic has happened?
Well, I can certainly go into a bit of the history. I was. It was back in 2016, which was when the whole over-tourism issue erupted, really. There was resident backlash in Barcelona and riots, and the word over-tourism was coined or brought to the fore by Skift, a prominent travel industry business magazine. And all of a sudden it appeared like over-tourism was erupting almost as a plague in different parts of the world, because the pressure points were where you just had too many people coming in at a time. So Venice was another example. But Flanders is right next to the Netherlands, and Amsterdam was also suffering from the success of its own promotion. And the CEO of Flanders was saying we have to avoid this, which was smart. And he was also smart by asking good questions. He said, what kind of tourism do we want? How do we balance our desire to maintain our culture and share it with others, but not be overrun and not lose, in a sense, not so much control, but well, maybe control of what we have to offer. So he brought me in to start, my brief was to be provocative. And I suppose most of my work really in the last few years has been bringing some of these fresh ideas about deep paradigm shifting, deep cultural shifting, the work you do, obviously, Daniel, so well, trying to bring that to an industry that is completely unaware of this kind of thinking. And bring to them the fact that, living in this vortex of uncertainty and complexity that would require us to deal very differently than we've done in the past. So that led to a number of sessions. One of again, that Flanders is extremely good at is that, and they have the wealth, that they have a large community of people responsible for tourism development at the community level. But they were able to bring both the private sector and the public sector together for a series of meetings around the country. And gradually, over a period of time, we were able to introduce the fact that, growth in itself of numbers was not really benefiting the country if the costs were not identified or mitigated. In other words, you could have a situation where you had a lot more people producing a lot less benefit or even negative benefit if you didn't take those into account. And that really perhaps a more systems approach, a living systems approach, would say, how can these communities start to flourish and thrive across a number of dimensions? And this is not new. I mean, we're looking at countries, of which New Zealand is one. Many are now, not many, but a number are saying, what are we here for? Is it just to produce more GDP, which is no measure of well-being, or are we here to produce greater well-being? So it was in that sort of context that I was able to start to talk about tourism as a living system, as a network, and that a successful network, human living system, would be like an ecosystem. It would have to flourish across multiple dimensions. And that caught on. So we started experimenting, taking small regions. But this whole notion of travel to tomorrow was, again, something the marketers created, which I thought was really good. And it became a focal point for thinking about doing things differently. The other thing that Flanders is really good at is this notion of collecting stories and telling stories of individuals making their contribution. So what that does is, again, it mirrors back to people that this is not some theoretical idea. It's happening in our own community now. And the question becomes, how do we nurture that? How do we nourish it? And so that then results in this other positive feedback loop, because people say, I can get involved in that nurturing process. So that was the history there. Now, because of various contractual reasons, I think basically I've had to step back. I mean, there are only so much I can do. But there now are, if you like, a group of enthusiastic change agents embedded in the community. And linkages are being made now, which I find exciting with other sectors of the economy. So it's a question of watch this space, because to me, the irony is it's a bit like how does a virus infect us? What we're looking at is taking the meme of a flourishing regenerative type of tourism that nurtures development and growth. We're trying to put that meme into the community and have it spread.
That notion is actually one that interesting. The quote you gave earlier of the New Zealand tourism official, because I have experienced that even before I started working with the term regenerative, I highlighted always that really the measure of wise decision making is the emergence of health and wholeness and well-being across the system at different scales, and even wrote a PhD on design for human and planetary health. What I've noticed is that people obviously through this COVID-19 situation, the word health has hit home to people in a whole new way, and the the link between ecosystems and planetary health and human health and population health is now not something that a few academics and a few futurists talk about, or the Planetary Health Alliance talks about, but everybody is starting to get that. And I think it is at the center. And in your 1995 paper that I quoted from earlier, you said that tourism is a healing profession. And the way that you speak of it, that network on living networks, I can see that that's really the essence of when we're exploring regenerative tourism. How do we create a tourism that is for itself, but is also part of a larger whole?
Yeah.
And gives back more than it takes, because that is actually if increasingly
Yes.
I find that for me, the essence of being regenerative is to dance between that polarity of being for oneself and being part of a larger whole in service to life. That's how you reconcile us to it. And
it's,
yeah, I have a more question, because you've worked in Mexico and in New Zealand also on similar projects, or with similar people trying to explore this. I just would love you to give a little bit of a flavor from your experience all over the world in the tourism industry, of how you see this conversation popping up in different places. Like my sense is that the regenerative tourism conversation is almost more advanced in Latin America than it has been in Europe. What's your sense?
Well, certainly, I think the regenerative conversation is more advanced there. The term has been used there much earlier than here. But I was thinking while you were asking me this, the work I did with Flanders, and it wasn't just me, there were a lot of other people that were already setting the stage, the folks in social tourism, they were doing this huge storytelling exercise, which was so helpful. It was softening the soil, if you like. But all that work that we took place between 2017 and 19 was done without really using the word regeneration at all. And in fact, I think in my own work, I feel by putting too much focus on regenerative tourism, it's a mouthful anyway. It's hard to explain from cold. But when we talk about creating a place that cares, which is what this the CEO of this Trade Export Council was saying, I think that resonates or links really well with this interest now in health and well-being. If you can demonstrate as a place that you care about your place, you care about the people, you care about the rest of life in that place, so you don't have dirty waterways, you aren't open pit mining, and putting people in danger. You are trying to create an economy that is healthy, but you are caring about each other. That is when and tourism, as I really identified, is fascinating to me, because the word hospitality is the same root as hospice and hospital. It's about caring, it's about holing, it's about making people whole. So we're in that business anyway. So I know I'm rambling a bit, but I think it's this focus away from selling something to someone else outside, and now coming back and making this place a healthy, whole, caring place that will attract. This is the difference. It will naturally attract people who are seeking those values. So it's standing head and shoulders. I say, look at the flowers. They don't have marketing plans and marketing expenditure. Each flower is doing its flower thing. It's being who it is, and it's attracting a certain kind of bee. It doesn't attract all of them. So can't we take that analogy in tourism?
No, it reminds me of one of my most important mentors, Brian Goodwin. He said to me once, Daniel, it's much more important to be the center of attraction rather than the center of attention.
Yes, that's beautiful. I'll remember that one. But that is the point. We know that people gravitate to people who are full of vitality and energy and enthusiasm. provided that they also are full of empathy and caring.
Mm.
You know, you can have vitality and enthusiasm and be a narcissistic bastard, and no one really wants to hang around you very much. You might get lots of attention, but you're not going to attract people into your community around you. And this is the same in tourism. They constantly are saying, how can we be the best? I said, you know, just be yourself. Nobody else can be you.
This, for me, this is like, as you were speaking, I was reminded of my highest hope. Like if the 5 big players in tourism here on the island that I live on, and I keep coming back to Mallorca because I just happen to choose to live on an island that is so dependent on tourism and almost responsible for the kind of tourism that we now see in the world. Like the people that are still alive today, they're still the patriarchs of these large tourism empires, were the ones that developed the kind of holiday village, all-inclusive tourism that has spread all over the world. And they've started here with a few hotels because of the beauty of this island. And now they have empires of 400, 500 hotels all around the world. And what I feel at this unique point where governments will have to take money into their hands that previously they would never have been willing to just unleash for a transformative process because it would have endangered the economy. Now that we've endangered the economy already, we're in kind of a different mode. Similarly, in Spain, there's always this saying, "Pan para hoy, hambre para mañana." Like the big tourism players were saying, the money is still coming in. What are you talking to me about? Like I'm doing something right here. I'm getting wealthier. So who are you, you little consultant, telling me that I have to do something else?
Yeah, you can make a lot of money out of slavery too.
but every well, which is that's a close to the bone comment about tourism and how some of them are optimizing their gains from it. But the sense that the vision that I would have for Mallorca is a local friend of mine and very respected kind of practice and thought leader here on the island who does a lot. Like I call him the Leonardo da Vinci of Mallorca because he's a stonemason and a gardener and everything, like builds arches. And he's launched a project which is called Baleares Verde, with the idea of planting 1 million trees in fruit forests all over the island. Not one big food forest, but wherever somebody's got a piece of land that they are willing to donate into this process, getting people in and increasing the amount of forest cover on the island, but bioproductive, food productive forest cover that we can use to start a biomaterials economy on the island that is circular, that we can increase food sovereignty with, that we can heal the hydrological cycle, bring back the rain, hold the rain in the ground, all those things that it would do if we planted 1 million trees and built the soil to nurture them and retained the water to feed them. And for me, a really bold leadership vision right now on this island would be to say, okay, here's the industry tourism. Here are all these provider industries. 45% of this island's economy is tourism. 80% are, if you include the providers, it's 80% of the island's economy. We can either live off government handouts, just about, twiddling their thumbs, watching Telecinco until the planes start arriving again, or we can say the next 2 years, we're just going to have, we will only allow 40% of the tourism that we had before, even if they wanted to come, maybe less. And we will pay people to help get this island shipshape again, to heal this island, to make this the most attractive destination in the future, since we've got 2 or 3 years until this multiple waves of this virus will get to a point where the virus gets less virulent and the situation will maybe adjust itself, nobody knows. Let's use it and do exactly that. Heal the island, build the local resilience, build food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, water sovereignty, rebuild the soils, put in the infrastructure, that we use wastewater to irrigate dry lands. And we could do it. I feel like, while for most tourism players, this kind of conversation feels like it's a diversion from core business, and that's not what we do. Ultimately, they rely on the beauty, health, and resilience of the destinations in which.
Well, that's what, you're saying with a lot more illustrative examples, what I'm basically saying as well. I think the challenge in Mallorca is that probably the tourism industry's wealth has been quite concentrated in the hands of a few big players. But the reality is, throughout Europe, is that, generally speaking, 95 to 98% of the participants, the suppliers in tourism, are small, medium-sized enterprises. So it's at the community level, I think. And I don't know the island well, but it's really getting this idea, this vision now amongst the young people of Mallorca that, are also sitting idly and wondering what's going to happen to them. I think, to sort of infect them with this vision that we don't want 20 years from now to be in a similar situation. The second message, of course, is that we may get on top of the pandemic, but all these other factors are not going away. I mean, the next thing, could be drought. We could go through a period of drought. We could, it's just that the economy is, again, another big issue. You're still dependent, if your tourism economy, on people having enough disposable income in your origin source markets to be able to come to Mallorca, and that may not be the case either.
Exactly.
So right now, I'm saying to people, if you've got a bit of land, start learning how to grow on it. You might be very grateful a few years from now. But the tourism industry, if they can start to realize the connection between, as you say, shade, food, water, going back to hosting, if you like, maybe the tourism industry starts to host parties of people who've come together for the purpose of growing things. You know what I'm saying? Go back to that idea as we're the hub in the community. We pull people together where ideas like this can circulate and ferment and percolate.
I mean, in this vision of could the tourism industry, in this, like, if they just accept that the crisis like this, if they start thinking in terms of 2 or 3 years response rather than this immediate response, because what's happening with the immediate response is that the regulations the government is writing around how you can reopen your hotel is making it impossible to be a responsible hotel anymore, because basically it's all about one way, like, how often do you have to change? You have to change this plastic apron and these plastic gloves and this. The amount of product that is we're just having the conversation about deplastifying the tourism industry, and they were doing a good job here on Mallorca when a lot of the chains have really kind of taking that serious in the last year. And now all the new regulations, it's all out of the window. Everything is very high. Only use once disposable security equipment that supposedly keeps people from being.
That's exactly the response that you would expect from this entire mechanical, materialistic worldview. It's that we can manage it and control it. And you end up just, if it wasn't dead before, you've destroyed it. I mean, the whole reason to come to an island like Mallorca is to sit in an open air cafe and watch people, conversing and music and dancing and touching each other and all the rest of it, all the stuff that we, reserved northerners in Europe want to experience, right? So, no, I think it's crazy. If I were an island, I'd say the most important thing, and that's what I think New Zealand is an island country, but you're an island within Spain, is to say, how do we make our island, how do we build its immune system so that this becomes a really healthy place where pandemics like this cannot, spread? How do we put in place, if you're going to have any interventions, it's more about how do you protect the island from infection from outside, but the best way of resisting disease is to build an immunity system. So that, there's a whole idea of putting people to stay inside for months on end and completely, not have sunlight, not have fresh air, not all of the rest of it, is also bizarre, because you're draining their immunity system. That's why I was talking about the care home situation. So if we can go back to this idea of how do we build a healthy community, a flourishing community in our own right, and then have the opportunity of extending the invitation, because we really know who we are and what we stand for, and we know the kind of people that are going to want to, are attracted to us. We then just simply invite. We don't have to pummel them to death with endless advertising and promotional things. We just say, this is who we are and what we're doing. People will want to come to see it, to experience it. Yeah, it's hard to get that idea across, but I think it's better than the ones we've got at the moment.
And I was working on a pathway to engage tourism in this vision of bringing Common Land Foundation and the Ecosystems Restoration Camp Foundation to Mallorca, in like basically almost weaving that with this impulse of the Baleares Verde proposal and say, okay, we could actually create a 20-year strategy of making this land more productive, of increasing the forests, of increasing our capacity to store water, and of building an entirely combustion engine free transport system that is available to people who need to move and isn't based on private vehicles, but on an infrastructure that allows people to move around the island on renewably, like powered by renewable energy. All of that could, as you hinted at, that could be part of the new offer.
But that is the new offer. That's what that guy was saying about the world is hunting for health and hunting for countries that care for their people and their environment. I believe that's the market of the future. If you talk about the quality market, everyone's saying volume to quality and blah, blah, blah. And that's not just about getting rich people spending a pile, coming into a 5-star resort. It's about people who want are looking for, they're looking to be made, they're looking for health. They're looking for an experience in a safe, healthy environment. We know that the natural world is healing. We know that the demand for nature is going up like crazy. So why not just focus on being the primary example of that in the Mediterranean? Turning the clock almost back in terms of the biological health, when those places were full of orange groves and then they became covered by concrete. But an island like Mallorca is in a perfect place to do this in Spain.
The day that I came back, I had to shortcut a visit to Portugal because of the beginning of lockdowns everywhere and so on. And I arrived the day that the national state of alarm was declared here on Mallorca, and asked the taxi driver, and he said, oh, they're going to close the airport tonight and so on. And I said to the taxi driver, vamos a volver a la isla de la calma. Mallorca used to be the island of calm. Boy, was I right. It was so incredibly quiet here on the island. I live near the airport. The airplanes are not flying. And so many Mallorcans, their soul was hungry to return to the island of calm. But at the same time, now they don't know how they're going to feed their families. So we need to somehow do the classic regenerative thing of how do we get out of this polarity and see the potential of actually making La Isla de la Calma.
If you could persuade, because you need someone with some resources, but if you could persuade one or two of the older families in Mallorca that have benefited from this phenomenal growth over the last 20 years and built international empires, if you could persuade them to make this their legacy piece, is to bring back the calm and the health of this island as their, and get them. And then the next thing is to really fill what I consider to be a growing vacuum. And vacuums can be useful. There's a vacuum that is another word for the hunger that is existing. How can we get out of this predicament? We don't want to go back to the noise, but we don't know how. So, okay, I don't have a checklist of answers exactly how, and neither do you. If we both did, we'd be quite wealthy. But, you know, where is the intelligence for that? It's in the community. So maybe you can get someone to support the idea, get the vision, but then support a whole series of, once you are out of the lockdown phase where you can't meet, you know, because that will happen. I don't know what the infection rate is on Mallorca, etc. But when you've got to that point, then you can have small gatherings. How can we start to seed a whole pile of conversations in different parts of the island, and also have them linked digitally as well, where they celebrate what is great about our community. What do we love about here? What are the produce that we think we do best, and blah, blah, blah. You know, but turn it around something tangible, not just ideas, not concepts, but get people talking and caring again. And out of that, I think, that mix.
Since we need to increase our food security rapidly to prepare for what's coming, it's a clear.
Maybe use food, and the hospitality people make it possible to meet and convene, but the focus is on food and health.
And the work that because you got caught in New Zealand with all this, and you were working with people in the Bay of Plenty on a project, helping them rethink their.
Well, yeah, I mean, the Bay of Plenty basically is one of 30 regions in New Zealand, and they had completely revamped their whole strategy. And one of the things that was really great about it was the amount of community engagement. I mean, they didn't just come up with a strategy, which often these DMOs do. They went out and found out what the community cared about, what they wanted, what they didn't want to see, because it wasn't one of the hot spots in New Zealand. It's a beautiful part of the country. So they did a lot of that. So there was that sense of engagement there. They also did some work on what they call their DNA. So what is it that is unique about us, and how can we express that? And they brought the importance of the resident population really caring or loving their own destination. So bringing those emotions of affection and pride and so on. So they began to weave in some, if you like, regenerative concepts of putting more back in than taking out. So they were about to launch this strategy. We had, at the very time that this whole pandemic thing was breaking. So we had some good sessions, and I was fortunate enough to be to one of the sessions where you remember that beautiful poem that came out of what is the voice of COVID? It's asking us to stop and reflect. It's a beautiful poem. I'm sure you're familiar with it. It's Italian. I think it was Ascolta, it was called. And I was able to read a bit of that poem. And what really impressed me was the resonance at a human level. It moved people. They realized that this message was what they wanted to hear. At the same time, their businesses were going, were tanking. So the challenge, I think, right now is that you've got, this emotional, almost spiritual desire to build something new, but you've got the reality of paying your bills, and you've got the reality of the organizational structure of what the budget is going to be and who's going to do what and all the rest of it. So where we're at with that is that Michelle Holliday and I felt that, we couldn't bring people together in groups because of the lockdown, that we would try and develop an online program that people could start to get involved in over the winter months, and just get some of these ideas that we're talking about now discussed in their communities, but have some access to information and ideas so that the recovery could gradually move in that regenerative direction.
But that would be specifically for communities in the Bay of Plenty area.
Well, no, where we're at the moment is trying to interest the 30 regional tourism organizations in subscribing to an online course that could then be made available to all of the businesses in their area. In other words, instead of us trying to sell online course to individual businesses, we would sell it to the region, and then they could just make it available. And this was before their lockdown is being lifted. They've done an exceptional job in New Zealand of taming the virus, as it were. So they're actually going back to allowing small group meetings of 100 people. But the idea was to find a mechanism of seeding, I think that's the best way of putting it, some of these regenerative concepts amongst the tourism community and getting conversations going.
While you were down there, did you connect? Because there's a huge amount of amazing regenerative practitioners, particularly in the Auckland Bay Area. And what's so powerful is that more than half of them have of Maori origin and have realized how, to some extent, what all this regenerative development and regenerative design and regenerative practice conversation is trying to do is to come back to a wisdom that they've been holding for centuries, which brings us back to the beginning of your story of your time in Canada, where you learned so much from.
Well, the Maori, I mean, I have been to I went out to New Zealand to do a PhD in 1972, and that's when I realized that I wasn't suited for academia. I found it too confining, but that's when I was first exposed to the Maori community, and then I spent a lot of time in the South Pacific. It's a Polynesian culture. But yes, this is the beautiful thing about New Zealand, is that it has this wealth of wisdom right in its midst. And what I'm saying is this program that we're developing, I'm trying to reach out to the Maori community, who've been very supportive of me personally in my presentations and so on, and said we have to do this together. This has to be has to weave in throughout it the Maori wisdom, because you have that resource. I made some contact with Caroline Davidson, who's with Cabal and the Regenerative Practitioners at the moment. And there's also, I made contact with Hugh Jelly, who's leading the whole regenerative agriculture movement in New Zealand. And I'm trying to, again, we need to bring all this together.
Tourism is a network.
So, it's tentative, it's difficult. I was in lockdown isolation for the time I was there, with very poor internet. So there were limits to what we could do, but we started something, and we'll see how it goes. We'll keep working on it.
One more question, so we don't make this recording too long.
I'm sorry.
Anybody who's still listening to it is already very committed, because we make.
We've rambled a bit too.
No, but we had a conversation. This is what is the important thing. You mentioned just before we started to record, you mentioned that you're part of this group that is more of an academic group that was looking into tourism and climate change. And we a couple of times skirted on this, that of course, on the one hand, there is a role for tourism, there is a importance, and like so many people's, like families' livelihood depend on tourism. On the other hand, it was part of driving climate change in a dangerous way. And so you mentioned that you put some ideas towards this group of academics and were somewhat surprised to actually see them land. Like what is your take on how tourism as a global network needs to respond to what is the much bigger danger on the horizon of cataclysmic climate change, and how to reinvent itself to not be complicit in driving it, but actually being an active agent in avoiding runaway climate change?
Well, I mean, tourism is a very large industry with hundreds of thousands of people involved, and there are a lot of people, individuals particularly, and some institutions that have been very concerned about its contribution to carbon emissions. The aviation portion of that is of main concern. So I would hate for there to be any implication that there isn't an awful lot of really good thinking and work going on that. But then COVID came along, and now everyone's focused on recovery from COVID, and climate change has sort of receded in the background. What I think we have to do is bring back that climate change issue and show that the way of approaching dealing with climate change is the same as the way of avoiding a pandemic. It's all interlinked. It's a system. And just the very idea that we created the COVID pandemic, it didn't appear out of the blue. It wasn't sent by the gods to punish us. We created the conditions that enabled those viruses to mutate. And until we take responsibility for that, and why did we do that? Because we're a society that's consuming way beyond the Earth's capacity to keep up with us, and we're destroying forests, etc., etc. So it's constantly a talk of showing the interdependence, the interconnection, and breaking down these silos of thinking that exist in our heads and certainly exist in our institutions. That's the first task, and I think COVID's done an awful lot to help us in that regard. Whether So is that an answer to your question? Because I tend to think and forget the original question.
It is a bit of a paradox, this whole, how important it is to stay able to travel and build global solidarity and connections and maintain that network that ultimately is part of connecting us into one human family on one planet that we deeply depend upon. And at the same time, finding the right measure again of when to travel, how long to travel, how often to travel. I think we've kind of gone for a decade or two, we were just beyond proportions of these fast turnover trips.
There were there's two kinds of travel that really, in my opinion, were doing the harm. One, it was the cheap travel, where no one in that value chain was paying the true price of it. Mm-hmm. The consumer wasn't, because it was being offered. The 25 pound flights from London to Nice, for example, for a party this weekend, that has to stop, and it will stop, because cheap travel is not. You can expect that as we come out of this and planes start flying, it will be a lot more expensive. So that impulse, just go because it's cheap, won't be there, which is important. The other contribution to the problem was that something like 75% of the emissions were contributed by 15% of the flyers, or even less than that. I'm not good at numbers, but that proportion. And that was because there were certain people in the population who would, again, they weren't necessarily trivial trips. They think they were important trips. They were going to see the banker. They were going to have meetings. This constant business-related flying and so on. Or it could be, someone in Ghana who's really wealthy and just pops back at the weekend to see their kids in the private school they're in, right? So there was an awful lot of what I call elitist excessive travel that was contributing to the emissions. If you take that out and you look at what we're left with in the next 2 years, we could have, it's not the end of international travel or flights. We are global. We are now a planet. We are now connected. I think it will start to regulate itself. But the most important thing is that we develop really attractive and meaningful opportunities for travel within our own spaces, so that need to jump on a plane is not as great as it was. But that need was really a manufactured one, in the sense that we could do it. But I think most people who were doing those kind of trips came back more exhausted than they went.
It's funny what you just spoke to is so typically actually Mallorquin in character. When you, like, I've lived here now for 10 years, and quite often when you say to people, I'm going to California, people would say, why want to go to California, go to Felanich, looks the same. Or then you say, I'm going to Galicia. Well, go to Yuk, looks the same. So because the island is so diverse on a very small island, it is actually true that that's why so much of the audiovisual industry likes using this as a place to shoot films, because you actually have such a diversity of landscapes. So in many ways, somehow it's in the Mallorquin soul to say, we live in the best place, we don't need to travel anywhere. But
well, if that attitude exists, then use that to harness this revitalization of the place. So people from one end of the island are encouraged to go and visit people at the other end of the island and exchange ideas and so on. But yeah, I would say that's a strength you have if they're sufficiently aware that they have the world in microcosm on the island.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation. We could go on, but this has been really rich. And as
soon as this is lifted up, I would love to come and explore with you. It sounds, because I do believe in islands. We are great places to work with. I was in the Azores and they're doing some very interesting things there. And I've got an interest in the Pacific, and they're incredibly vulnerable. And I think, what we could do it's important that we try and support them, because we've basically extracted so much wealth and pleasure out of those places with putting very little back in.
No, I mean, I moved to Mallorca because Mallorca is the right size for being an example of regional regeneration. So it's a bioregional case study, and then I think islands, because they come in different shapes and sizes, they're wonderful field study opportunity for regional transformation and in this healing of the landscape and healing of the relationship between people and landscape that we actually need to do everywhere around the world. But it's a little bit easier to do. Well, it's difficult in one way, but it's also easier in another to do it on islands because they're well defined. And I think that unleashing, like if we find examples of how regional tourism players on 10, 15 islands around the world became active catalysts of that turnaround to help be healers of their islands and reinvent themselves, that lesson will then also go on to the mainland. That would be a really catalytic example. And again, those destinations who lead with that kind of vision will be remembered in the future and will be centers of attraction.
No, I agree. And I think because you can get a lot more, you're going to get results faster on an island because there aren't all of the distractions of having these flows from outside. You can focus more. So yes, I agree. Let's do that. Let's find examples and share them.
Yeah, I would love to work with you on one of them, but you'd have to come to Mallorca for it because I'm not anymore.
No, you stay there and look after that beautiful daughter of yours and your beautiful wife and Mallorca. We need you there. Okay.
Thank you so much. And
all right.
hold on.